right, it is my great pleasure to introduce the next in our series of Psychopharm Friday interviews. This is Dr. Stephanie Groman. She's an assistant professor of anesthesiology and critical care and also affiliated with the Neuroscience Institute and the Committee on Neurobiology at the University of Chicago. Dr. Groman did her PhD with one of our Psychopharm Friday alums, if you would, if I'd be so bold as to call it that, Dr. David Jensch. And then she went on to do a postdoc with Jane Taylor and has moved recently from the University of Minnesota, where she started as assistant professor, to the University of Chicago. Dr. Groman, welcome.
Thank you so much, Steve. I'm really excited to be here.
We're very excited to have you. And so today we're going to start by discussing a paper that Dr. Groman published in Psychopharmacology in 2022. The paper is Adolescent Reinforcement Learning Trajectories Predict Cocaine-Taking Behaviors in Adult Male and Female Rats. And this is Viliama et al. From 2022. So Dr. Groman, could you tell us a little bit about what you did in this paper and some of the main findings?
Sure. Yeah. So this paper kind of stemmed from some work that I had done as a postdoc in Jane Taylor's lab, looking at how individual differences in decision-making predict future drug-taking behavior. And so our previous work had shown that individual differences in the ability of subjects to kind of update their responses or update their choices in response to reward was subsequently predictive of future drug-taking behavior. But the vast majority of these studies had been done in adult animals. And so we were kind of interested in understanding where these individual differences emerged. And so we knew that, maybe there are some genetic components, but most of these animals were presumably related to one another. They have a similar rearing environment. They had a similar environment when they showed up. So where were these differences in decision-making kind of emerging? And so one hypothesis was that these were kind of occurring during adolescence. And so in a study that we had done a couple of years ago, we quantified decision-making across adolescence and found that, yes, decision-making processes improved during adolescence, and that seems to predict decision-making in adulthood. And so this study was really designed to kind of test this link between decision-making trajectories in adolescence and then subsequent drug taking in adulthood, with the idea there being that maybe vulnerability to addiction that we think is potentially being regulated by decision-making processes might emerge during this adolescent period. So in order to do this, we took rats, we bred rats in-house, and then we assessed their decision-making across different adolescent periods, and specifically across quite a broad range of what would be considered adolescence, which we can talk about, And so we looked at how these trajectories kind of change over time during this period, and then once they're adults, so at this later point. And then we had animals, once they were done with these decision-making assessments, we implanted them with intrajugular catheters and then trained them to self-administer cocaine. And so the goal there was to see whether the variation that we saw in adulthood, whether that predicted drug-taking behavior, kind of recapitulating the stuff that we had previously observed. And then importantly, whether the trajectories of those same individuals during adolescence was predicting future drug-taking behavior. And so when we looked at those relationships, what we found was that, in fact, yes, it was the trajectory during adolescence that predicted future drug-taking behavior. And so animals that showed these more attenuated or more stunted trajectories had more difficulty kind of improving during adolescence, ended up taking significantly more cocaine than animals that showed this improvement. And so what this suggests is that, these addiction vulnerability phenotypes might actually emerge much earlier than, either early adulthood or like late adolescence, but might be kind of emerging during these critical periods.
Really interesting. So, so you mentioned that, especially that it's the trajectory of development of this kind of ability to update one's performance based on what's going on in the world that really predicts the cocaine vulnerable phenotype that you see later. What is it about that trajectory? Do you think it's kind of like where they start, or is it that they just like are differentially responsive to the reward somehow, and therefore are more or less likely to be able to improve from said starting place? What do you think is going on there?
Yeah, these are very interesting questions. So I think, so when we did this first study looking at decision making across adolescence and then decision making in adulthood, and kind of looking at those relationships. I initially hypothesized that you would see, how you started, or how you behaved in adolescence would perfectly map onto how you did in adulthood. And so that was the initial analysis I did, and we didn't find anything, and I was actually very disappointed. I was like, oh man, this doesn't so what you do during adolescence doesn't matter. It doesn't seem to impact. And it wasn't until I started thinking about, well, maybe it's actually not just the magnitude of these effects during adolescence, but what if it's the change? Um, and that's indeed what we see, is that like the degree of improvement is what predicts your decision making, and that's also what predicts drug taking behavior. And so why is it that change? I don't necessarily know, other than what I think is happening during that time is that what you're seeing is changes in the brain that are mapping onto the behavior, right? And so one of the hypotheses now is that, what you're kind of seeing falling out in the behavior is some kind of change in the circuitry that kind of controls these decision-making processes, and therefore makes you more or less susceptible to drug use. But it doesn't seem to be. What is interesting is that essentially it's not like what you were kind of saying, Steve. It's not like where you start, because even the animals that are performing very well at like early adolescence, what we would consider like P30, if their trajectory is stunted, they will end up taking more drug. And so it's really something about this change. And what that is, we don't know. We don't know the biology. We're, trying to dig into that. And that's one of the things that my lab is kind of focused on now, is that, we know a lot about what happens in the brain in rats during adolescence. We don't know how that maps onto behavior. That has been fairly limited. And we also don't know how these dynamic changes in biology that are going on within the brain during that time match on to like these dynamic changes in behavior. And so that's what we're trying to figure out right now. Sorry, I will
Interesting.
stop.
So yeah, no, that's fascinating. So would you then like, is an implication of this, and maybe this is kind of overextending or anthropomorphizing or something like that, but would you predict that like having experiences in adolescence that sort of open up your mind or give you brand new types of experience about what the world's like? I don't know, you maybe go on a road trip, or you
Yeah.
get some new type of interactions with different kinds of people or something that you never had before adolescence, that would then kind of cause some kind of development of these circuits you're talking about in adolescent period, thus leaving you more resilient to, perhaps addiction later on. Is that
Yeah.
is an implication, or is that taking it too far?
No, I think that's totally valid. So I don't know like the extent of these experiences, and that's definitely a big question, right? But I will tell you that we have data showing that social interactions are super important for this. So if you isolate animals, particularly during adolescence, what you see is these stunted decision-making trajectories, right? And essentially those animals are the ones that take more drugs. And so what is it about the social interactions that is doing something, right? Do you have to have positive social interactions, right? Is it just social interactions in general? Like, what exactly is that social component doing to the biology that's leading to these changes, right? Like, we just don't know, right? And I think it's super fascinating because it's like, are the rats kind of experiencing, periods of conflict that they have to navigate, just like humans, right? Like, you imagine like adolescence is like the whole time you're just navigating these complex social experiences, maybe the rats are doing the same thing. And that's what's kind of leading to those. So yeah, so I think it's definitely like environment dependent. The environment is doing something, interacting something with the biology that can like kind of dictate where your trajectories end up.
Interesting. So then, if I'm understanding you, like it's possible maybe that even negative events or things what we neuroscientists often will call adversities that occur in this period maybe actually could end up causing, these development of these circuits that kind of that actually may end up with positive outcomes in some way. So being able to navigate those adversities or perhaps get over them or deal with them might actually be a good thing and not
Yeah.
necessarily just a bad thing.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Like teaching you how to like, essentially like learning how to cope or like deal
Mm.
with these situations, because I think we often think about at least, with animals, it's like we put them in a cage and we're like, oh, they're having social experiences and these must be positive, right? But I think most of us will, believe that, not every social experience is positive, right? And so kind of getting into, yeah, trying to figure out like which aspects of these social experiences are doing the things. Maybe it's all of them. Maybe it's a positive and the negative. Maybe like, there's certain ones that are having a bigger impact. So yeah, those are the like we have an ongoing study now where we're trying to like narrow in on this specific period. Is it like P30 to P40? You have to have this, right? Is it P40 to P50? And just like getting into like the nitty-gritty of it so that we can know exactly, well, what's going on in the brain at P30, what exactly is changing from 30 to 40 that leads to this.
Yeah,
So
exactly. And so postnatal day 30 or so is often, I think, talked about in the field as this initial start of adolescence.
yeah.
It's a little bit of a, somebody's picking a round number that's kind of in the ballpark, but I don't think you can make a strong case that it's not P29, for example, or something like that.
Right, right,
Um,
right.
and then so that kind of gets into my next question I had is like, what is adolescence? So like we could just put a number, it's 30 to 75 or something, postnatal day 30 to 75 in rats, and it's maybe, 10 or 11 to 18 or whatever in humans.
Yeah.
But like what is it that's special about this period? Is there a starting place? Like, is that puberty or is that not puberty? How does this play out in the two sexes, which of course go through puberty in both species, in animals and in humans, at different ages? What's your
Mhm.
take on what is adolescence?
Yeah, right. Yeah. So that's a great question. And I think the field struggles with that as a whole, right? And so I think, typically if you talk to human researchers, right, they would say, I don't know, maybe even like 10 years ago, maybe like BJ Casey will know this better than me, but like, people would have said that like adolescence is, from 11 to, 19. And that window just keeps getting bigger and bigger as we know more and more about brain development, right? Historically, it's been kind of based off of behavior, though. People saying, well, at 18, most people have, left the house and are establishing independence from their primary caregiver. They're able to like kind of make decisions on their own and navigate the world as an independent individual. And as people have got as the field has grown and we've integrated more neuroimaging approaches, right? And that the like definition that was once based off of like more sociological properties is now kind of moved into the biology, right? So it's like, well, now we're pushing it to 25 because this is when gray matter stops, right? We see like gray matter, white matter kind of plateauing. And so the definition or the like the timeline for adolescence, which is interesting in humans, has kind of evolved over the last couple of years as we've integrated. And that for animals has not happened. It really like like we just don't know what the equivalent adolescent period is in rats. And I think that's in part because the definition in humans is very different from the definition in animals, right? And so when does gray matter, white matter density stop changing in the rat? I don't know. I'm sure there's people who have done studies on this, and looked at this in very specific things. But like historically, a lot of the field has been focused on what you kind of mentioned is like puberty, right? Onset of puberty and at the age when animals are able to reproduce. And so females, I think the reproductive age is about postnatal day 35, maybe to 40, versus males, it's like a little bit longer, like 45 to 50. And that has been considered, either the start or like the middle of adolescence. And then there's a couple days on either side that, have been argued to be like the window. But like in humans, we're able to reproduce at 10, right? And I think most people would agree that probably adolescence doesn't start until, 13, 14, and that it's this much longer period, this period of protracted, growth, neural growth, right? And behavioral growth. So I think I think we know a lot about the biology in animals. We know not so much about the behavior, and we know a lot about the behavior in humans. And so like our work is kind of trying to integrate both of those. Can we like use the behavior to kind of inform when these biological processes are emerging? And can we use that biology to then kind of inform like, oh, this is what's happening during this period of potentially adolescence? And so I think one of the things that kind of came out from this particular study and other studies is that, initially I thought that this decision-making processes would probably only improve during that window of adolescence that has been defined in the rat from 30 to 50. Um, and what we kind of found was that the decision-making processes were improving from P30 to P70 and then kind of stabilized at P90. And when you look at how all of these, measurements are kind of related to one another, it was almost as if everything from P70 down to P30 was really tightly correlated, and everything at P90 on was really tightly correlated. And so what that suggests to me is that there's just these two distinct ages. And whether, adolescence in the rat is persisting all the way out until P90, I don't know. We haven't fine-tuned it enough. But I think that that's telling us something about the behavior, right? And it's telling us something about like there's these two phases in the rat life, that maybe might be adolescence and maybe might be adulthood. But I think maybe using these more behavioral approaches might help us to kind of align with what we consider the adolescent period in humans.
Interesting. So it kind of reminds me that P90 sort of divide there. It kind of reminds me of like that age of 25 that you mentioned as like the kind of in humans, which most people wouldn't call a 24-year-old an adolescent probably, but your PFC is still kind of developing at least, and arguably maybe is this analogous to what's happening in the rats up to that kind of early adulthood?
Yeah.
Maybe that's the cutoff. In other words, like once the brain is sort of wired up the way it's going to be wired up from then on, that's functionally speaking the end point of adolescence, or is
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, that's exactly. Yeah. And like now we're thinking about it as like this is essentially this critical period for these prefrontal circuits, this adolescence period is when that's happening. And that the basically what we see is that decision making improves and then it kind of stabilizes. And the point at which it stabilizes, you basically, no matter what we do to the animal, we really can't change that. So like, if we train them more, it's not like they continue to get better in the task. If we, do subtle manipulations, not, lesioning specific regions, but like, it seems very stable over time. And so what that suggests to me is that basically that might just like close that critical period for those decision-making circuits. And so we have some studies now that we're trying to like kind of reopen this critical period. So essentially, if that is the case, then if we kind of restore plasticity within these circuits, can we keep getting decision-making improvements, right? That might then reduce drug susceptibility in adulthood.
Interesting. How do you go about doing that? Or maybe
Yeah.
it's a secret or something, but
Yeah.
sounds fascinating.
Yeah, no, so we're interested. So basically, the one of the things we did a huge proteomic analysis that was basically trying to just identify novel proteins, right, that might be involved in decision making. And the things that fell out were actually related to perineuronal nets, which was totally unexpected, and yet really exciting because what we know about PNNs is that they form these basically like net-like structures around neurons and kind of like stabilize these circuits. And so what we found, at least in our animals, is that the number of nets, particularly in the orbital frontal cortex, increases during adolescence and kind of stabilizes. And if we remove those nets, we can actually see behavior continue to improve beyond the point that we would expect. And so what we think is happening is that these like basically these nets are kind of coming on and solidifying these decision-making circuits, and that when these manipulations that lead to attenuated decision-making circuits, the PNNs come on much earlier. And so they basically, it's like this precocial development of PNNs that stabilize these circuits way before they should, right? And so we're hoping now if we can essentially kind of temporarily dissolve these nets with these enzymes, that are available, then you can have this brief period of plasticity and then resolidification. So it's not like a temporary, you're not amnestic, right, for the rest of the time. So those are the things that we're kind of thinking that's how these circuits kind of form and lead to these stabilization of behaviors.
Wow, super interesting. Another question that kind of occurs to me is, I bet you that if, as you mentioned, the definition of adolescence has kind of evolved over the
Yeah,
years. And I bet you if we were to go back like 50 years and ask people what's an adolescent human, they may have a different answer. Obviously, they didn't know about the brain stuff that we're talking about now. But
sure.
in terms of like the functional roles in society, perhaps, it was less common to do secondary education and maybe variety of things. Maybe you just kind of go off into your own adult life a little earlier in those days. And maybe some have argued, I think that kind of have like a longer adolescent period now in a societal kind of a way.
Yeah,
What do you think about that? Is that something that like would, for example, let's say the perineural nets are the mechanism by which we kind of fully gel the brain and adolescence is over after that occurs, unless you mess with them, of course.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
is that something that's just like, okay, you go through, puberty, or you had some starting positions is here, and then it's just X number of years or days or whatever after that is the end, and then everything stabilizes? Or is it going to be subject to kind of like what's going on, like how independent must the individual be in the world versus can you remain childlike, so to speak, in terms of being taken
Yeah,
care of by parents and so on for longer periods? This is often typical in the West, in kind of the US and so on.
yeah.
What's your take on that?
Yeah, that's an interesting, I hadn't thought about that. That's very interesting. Um, you would imagine it must be situational, right? But then how does that how do the nets know of these situations? Right? How do like environmental or like social factors then trigger like these nets to come on? There must be some interaction that between like environment and these nets. I don't know of anybody, I'm trying to think of anybody looking at like these more complicated kind of relationships. Like the one thing I do know is there's a ton of people that are looking at diet. And so maybe that there's something to do with like the types of diet, but how that would change throughout adolescence, I don't know, right? Yeah, that's a really good question, Steve.
I have more questions that I have no idea what the answer to are than
Sure.
anything else. But yeah, that's it's kind of like, you had said previously that like, a historic definition of human adolescence is kind of when you go off into the world or whatever, which in a
Mhm.
rat really arguably is like postnatal day 21, usually is when
Yeah,
we wean rats and take them away from mom and they're no longer drinking milk and they have to like eat food and interact with each other in their litter or released or whatever.
right.
Um, so that's, usually earlier, quite a bit earlier than what we consider
Yeah,
adolescence. And I don't know, maybe there's just part of this is a species difference too. Maybe rats just don't get as much parental care as humans do, and that might just be a variable that we sort of, it just apples to oranges in some
yeah,
way
yeah.
as
Well, and
well.
it's also like people have talked about like, there's a beautiful paper that by I can't remember now who the name, but it was like a comparison of like, when is adolescence in the rat, and it's like trying to correlate it with humans, and essentially it just comes down to like you can't make these comparisons. But it's like, yeah, when you consider like, at day 12 is when they open their eyes, right? And that's like way later than like what happens in humans, right? But then humans don't walk, for a full year, and then rats are like, open their eyes at 12 and then are walking at 14. So there's just a number of differences that make it very challenging.
Yeah, I think that's something that we all, as animal
Sure.
neuroscientists studying animals, always struggle with is like, ultimately these are not little humans, little furry humans. They have some species differences that really do matter, and it's really more principles of,
Right.
both have something like this adolescent phase. Exactly when it starts and stops is hard to know, or maybe impossible to directly analogize, but still the same process occurs in terms of the wiring of these prefrontal circuits and things, and so presumably principles would be relevant across species, hopefully.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And do you have a sense like maybe this is a another unfairly big picture question, but and I'm just curious for your perspective on like, is there sort of like a evolutionary function to adolescence? Meaning, like, is there something? Because obviously, there's kind of critical periods in various developmental processes, as you mentioned, for
Mhm.
visual system occurs in both humans and animals and things. That there's a window early in life where you need to see, or else you're never gonna really be able to wire your brain up properly to see.
Yeah. Yeah.
So why have this one come on so much later? Like, you can essentially humans can do everything, animals too can do basically everything, walk around, do things, make decisions, etc. And yet then now we open up this plasticity window that where a lot of stuff can kind of get stamped
Yeah.
in some way. What is it about that period that is why would a brain work develop like that? What's the point of it? And again, I'm not asking you for the answer. I'm just curious, like your take on that
Yeah.
question.
Yeah. I guess, yeah, like I always think it's like, you know, I like as you were talking, I was like, oh yeah, this is kind of like I equate it to like postdocing. Like, like you're maybe not ready to be fully independent, right? And you're gonna make some weird mistakes, and like, maybe like this time to kind of develop these other soft skills that maybe you hadn't, as a child you hadn't learned, right? Or in this case, as a graduate student, maybe you hadn't learned. Um, but I think there's, uh, decision making in particular is quite complicated when you think about, especially how we do it as humans and even the rats, right? Like, a decision in one environment, when you're presented with the same decision to make in different environments, your outcome can be totally different, right? What you choose can be totally different. And so you kind of have to navigate those using much more complicated processes and strategies, right? Like, oh, with these particular groups of friends, I shouldn't say these certain things, right? Or like, I should only do these things when my parents are around. And so I don't know if maybe this adolescent period is kind of teaching you how to make these adaptive choices across different environments, rather than what you typically see in children is a lot of like very stereotype behavior, right? And so maybe this is allowing us to be more flexible and in a more adaptive way, and that's what this period is. And you can do it under this umbrella of, not being eaten by the lion out in the, Sahara because your mom's like, you're not going out there, or like, something evolutionary where it kept us, like we could practice these things without having the risk of it. That's what I think.
Interesting. No, that's I
Yeah.
think a great answer. Yeah. It occurs to me that like, as you mentioned this before too, is that like the social interactions that humans are undertaking in this period become a lot more complex at that point. If nothing else, there's like another layer added on them of like romantic sorts of
Yes.
possibilities and
Right.
things, sexual stuff and things like that.
Yeah.
But then also, these just that other kinds of relationships become more complex. Your maybe relationship with your parents becomes more complex at that period as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, that I think is probably all part of the same answer that you're mentioning there.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, everybody can think back to like how cringy it is, during those early phases. Like I have nieces and nephews now who are of that age, and it's very much like I'm like, oh yes, I remember behaving like this. We are terrible. Yes.
Wow. And then one thing that's kind of it just occurs to me, especially you mentioned that you have nieces and nephews that are currently kind of adolescents. We obviously just went through kind of a societal weird period with the pandemic and whatnot. And a lot of people talk about like, what does that mean? Like, how does that
Yeah.
play out in terms of, early childhood education and things? But it occurs to me that, given the stuff we're talking about here in adolescence, it's this period where like, a lot of stuff kind of gets locked in for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
Do you have concerns, or are you thinking about it all? Like how these kinds of stressors, or actually really variable experiences, probably some people had good experience in the pandemic, that while they were adolescents, do you feel like that's going to be likely to have long-term consequences in people that grew up under those kinds of circumstances?
Yeah, I mean, I think for sure I think there's going to be an impact. And I think there is a lot of concern within the mental health field. Like people are, there's a lot of discussion about Even now, a lot of undergraduate students who had gone through the pandemic and these like middle early adolescent period, having trouble with anxiety, right, having extreme, way more mental health issues than previous classes. And so I think people are looking into that now and trying to think if there's ways that we can kind of intervene, right? Or like if these things are kind of stamped in, how can we kind of deal with this new mental health state that we're in? And so yeah, I think there's been a lot of focus on people who have subsequently kind of developed anxiety or mental health issues as a consequence of that. But there's also, I think, some emerging data talking about even resilience amongst individuals. And like there's been a couple I think more recent papers that have been trying to kind of look at kids who had similar experiences with the pandemic and then kind of diverged on these mental health issues. And so it's exciting because I think that's we, as in the field of mental health and as scientists, it's always looking, we're kind of, tend to focus on these negative things, right? Like what leads to depression, what leads to anxiety, and how can we do these? And then a lot of this data is now coming out on the flip side. Like maybe there's things that we can do to promote resilience amongst individuals and kind of bump up that level so that when we do, I mean, hoping that we don't experience this again, but like if something like this happens, right? Like we have a buffer, right? Or we have these things in place that we know will make, won't lead to these outcomes.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess that kind of in some ways brings me to another topic that I thought would be interesting to discuss. It has to do with a sort of aspects of our personal lives that we have in common, which is that we both have had children recently in the last year or two.
Yeah.
And, I think us as scientists who are studying development and how it impacts the brain, and now we're actually sort of seeing this play out in our own personal lives with our little humans that are running around and learning a
Right.
lot of stuff from us and hopefully not too many bad things. This is, it's a kind of an interesting position to be in. And I'm curious if you would have any, would like to comment on kind of how that's played out for you and for your family. And yeah, maybe we could chat a little bit about that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, so as a, behavioral neuroscientist, as you know, right, you like there's oftentimes, like our training is in how to get animals to do very specific things, right? And I thought I was like, I'm the most well-equipped individual for a child, right? Like, I know all the tricks, right? I can get rats to do amazing things, right? How could it not be the same for a human? It is wildly different, right? It is not the same. And it is amazing how quick everything that you know not to do, you end up starting to do, right? So I don't know if you guys have tried to do like the sleep training, and like all of that stuff. And it's like, for everybody who doesn't know, who's gonna watch this, it's like you're not supposed to pick up the baby when it cries, right? You like leave him in his crib or him or her in the crib, and you don't do it. And that almost like falls out the window after like 2 weeks. Right?
Instincts kick in. It's really hard to ignore that cry. I'll tell you that's for sure.
Right. And you're just like, I don't care. Like you can come sleep in the bed with me. Like it just doesn't matter. I just need to sleep tonight. Yeah. And it's like, all these things that like I was like, I know exactly what this is doing. This is reinforcing bad behaviors. Like he's gonna learn to cry. And so now he does that. He just stands up and he cries and I come and we start this whole thing.
Avery
So
was right. Too bad we can't actually implement it.
right.
It's funny.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's just wild how quickly they pick up on these things, right? When you think of how like, like especially like when we think of development, right? When we think of a human development and like, basically they, come out completely like, can't do anything for themselves, can't even hold up their head, right? They don't have muscle to hold up their head. Um, and then by like, so my son is now 13 months, right? And it's like he is telling me what to do, right? He's telling me what he wants, right? And like, don't do this. And like, you move over here, like he's not verbally doing it, but it's still just like, Oh, so like you understand how things work. And this is we didn't teach him any of this, right? It's all like, he's just seeing it and observing. So it's just like it's fascinating to see this kind of play out in real time.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, it makes you kind of wonder. It makes me think sometimes, these kinds of a lot of these kinds of things that you just discussed, like are sort of we can see that the child is telling us things because we're, also human and we can kind of understand they have intentions and motivations that are very human in
Yeah.
nature. And it's amazing to see these develop just before your eyes. And it makes me kind of circle back and think about my own rat work a little bit too. Like,
Yeah.
is this also going on there? Are we like just
Yeah.
not really
Yeah.
perceiving the signals that other rats are perceiving from these developing animals? Is there aspects of the way we usually do these studies that are really just kind of throwing a wrench in these processes, pulling away the
Mhm.
pups from the mother at 21 exactly, and they all now live together in a group? I mean, that doesn't happen in the world. Maybe that's just kind of like
Right.
not
Right.
how rats normally develop, actually, and we're sort of like studying an artifact in some ways in our studies. I don't know. Do you wonder about that stuff too, or am I
Oh,
just
oh,
overthinking
all the time, all
it?
the time, all the time. Yeah. Like, what are we doing by doing this? Like eventually, like my dream is to have one of those like, giant setups, right? Where like everybody lives together, they all live in this giant room, and then they just like volunteer to go into the operant boxes, and like RFID chip scans them as they walk in and they get to do it. But yeah, it's like a lot of these, like the regimented, which is like science, right? Like controlling for things, but this regimented, we have to remove them, exactly at P21, and they get pair housed. We even house them not with their siblings. We pull them apart from their siblings intentionally for a lot of these studies. What does that do, right? Are they like basically it's like we send them to college, maybe when they're like, I don't know, 8, um, so yeah, so it's like that. And I think a lot about even like maternal care. Like I think there's this general assumption that like maternal care is pretty similar across all the rats. And I bet there's all this variability in there that we just don't account for, because we just don't really know how to quantify it. Or I mean, people have ideas about how to quantify it, but we're not doing it like long term.
Yeah, and even I mean, in my lab, we actually are looking directly at that specific question with some of our early life adversity studies,
Yeah.
where we believe actually it's the maternal care that
Yeah.
is like sort of patterns of maternal care that actually lead to these developmental changes that have kind of negative or positive sorts of consequences
Yeah.
down the road. And even though we absolutely know that, we still, in any other study that's not looking at that particular variable, we just kind of may order rats from some
Yeah.
company and they just
Yeah.
show up. God knows what happened to them before. Are they related or not? Is it what room are they from? All these kind of things matter actually a lot. We know this. People have studied this and show that. And we just sort of are forced to ignore that in some ways for
Yeah.
practical purposes within the sort of endeavor that we're doing research wise,
Sure.
which is, tough. I mean, it makes sense. Obviously, stripping down variables and studying them one at a time is a good way to
Yeah.
go. You kind of have to,
Yeah.
but it does make you wonder what we're missing
Yeah.
grand
Yeah.
scheme of things, especially once you see all those complexities in an N of one in your own child in your own house, like where did that come from? Like these kind of things really make you think. So it's kind of an interesting case, I think, of your one's personal life and interests impacting your scientific interests and maybe there's other direction as well.
Yeah.
I feel like that happens a lot, at least in neuroscience. People studying
Right.
things for personal reasons, and
Yeah. We used to call it research is me search, right?
yeah. Yeah, I don't know what that says about us studying psychiatric disorders all the time, but that's okay. You can draw your own conclusions, I suppose. Um, um, yeah, so I guess I actually had one other sort of specific question about that kind of circles back a little bit to the study that we started with. Um, and it has to do with like types of rewards. So,
Mm,
as I read it, one of the basic phenomena that you reported here was that when you're testing rats at when they're young adolescents, middle or later adolescents, they're performing this task in which they, are poking a certain nose poke to get a high probability of reward, and at some point that changes. That nose poke becomes a bad choice, and some other one becomes a good choice, and they have to notice that and go and find that. And you
Yeah.
did these really clever analyses of kind of analyzing the patterns of responding. So did they just get a reward, and what's the probability of them doing the same thing or different things in subsequent trials? And all of that really was to do with food reward, with their working for food, basically. And then later on in life, you show that their performance on that, their ability to kind of respond to rewards by doing it again and versus doing something else, predicts their liability to take a lot of cocaine in a 6-hour session. And
Yeah.
I'm wondering to what extent it matters that you tested the adolescent phenotype, the decision-making phenotype, using a food reward in particular, as opposed to any other kind of reward. Or on the flip side of it, in adulthood, does it matter that it's cocaine in particular? Would you predict that these are the traits that you're seeing develop over adolescence that predict cocaine use later would equally apply to any other drug you put them in with? Or is there something about cocaine that makes this relationship specific?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so the food reward is somewhat interesting. So we have in my lab historically only used food. So we've this particular study we used a sweetened condensed milk reinforcer, especially for these younger animals because there's no upper limit to how much sweetened condensed milk they'll drink. It's remarkable, you know. These little 30-gram, little pups will drink 30 mLs of sweetened condensed milk, no problem. So we've done that, and then in the adult studies we've also used like sucrose pellets, and the same relationship holds for both of those. I have a colleague, Summer Thompson, who's in Jane Taylor's lab. She's a postdoc there, and she's observed similar relationships using a water reward in mice. And so it seems like, at least in this case, it's reward related, whether it has to be food reward or it can be like a liquid reward or something. All these relationships kind of hold true. And so I don't think it's necessarily specific to just a food or a particular food, or even if it has to be necessarily a totally palatable food, right? Like a sweetened condensed milk reinforcer. But I'm trying to think if anybody else did anything. Yeah. So the predictive relationship is actually super interesting because so this study was done using cocaine. And what we've seen with adult animals is that individual differences in the response and their ability to kind of adjust their behavior in response to rewards that emerges during adolescence, that seems to we've shown that it predicts cocaine self-administration. In another study, it predicts methamphetamine self-administration, and then I'm currently working on a paper that's showing that it predicts oxycodone self-administration. And so what we think is going on is it's just kind of predicting addiction liability in general. And why that is, I don't know. Right? We have no idea like why this particular phenotype is leading to those differences. And so it could just be that when so one possibility is that when you're just put into a box and you have an option of like hanging out and doing nothing versus like taking some drug, then like, of course, this is, like animals are going to take that drug. So we're hoping to start up a study where we actually give the animals kind of choices between different drugs, right? Like, do you want cocaine? Do you want some oxy? And then seeing maybe if we see similar types of relationships and whether those are specific to different classes. And that I think will allow us to kind of really figure out if it really is an addiction susceptibility phenotype, then it won't be specific, but if it's maybe like a choice thing, then we might see something. And so I think that kind of gets to like, maybe it's, is it drug specific and food specific? Like, these are complex relationships, but hopefully that will kind of, I don't know, we'll be able to maybe see something in there that we didn't.
Yeah, that'll definitely be informative. It sounds like you have lots of work to do on this topic, as we all do. But you've really made some great strides, and this is, I think, a really fascinating paper and some very clever analytical approaches as well, very sophisticated ones. Not totally sure I understood absolutely everything, to be honest with you, but I'm very impressed, and I think it's a very sophisticated work, and I love the stuff you've been up to. And I also just wanted to thank you again for having this conversation with me. I've learned a lot, and really enjoyed it, and I appreciate the time that you've given to this.
Yeah, this has been super fun. Thanks so much. I really enjoyed it.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. It was a pleasure.